Simon Snyder. Simon Snyder was a young man who was actually apprenticed to an artisan as a young man. He did not come from the wealth you might expect for someone who would go on to become governor of Pennsylvania. He ends up skipping the American Revolutionary War itself and instead opens and operates a grist mill because he has to take care of his family. This is not uncommon at the time. You know, we like to think every single person either signed up for the Brits or the Patriots, but no, most people stayed out of the war. Simon Snyder was one of these people. He opened up a grist mill, but he became a leader in his community, and he actually is elected as a justice of the peace at a very young age because his community trusts him. Furthermore, he dedicates himself to public virtue, and by the time he's in his early 30s, he's actually sent to the Pennsylvania 1790 Constitutional Convention. Pennsylvania's first constitution, as we've talked about, it was very strange. It had one legislature. It didn't have a governor. Technically, it had a president who was really president of that legislature. It's very interesting, and it didn't work out super great. So instead, they made a governorship, and Simon Snyder was part of the group that made that constitution. But then he goes back home, where he remains a justice of the peace, but he keeps operating his grist mill until 1797. 7 years later, Snyder was elected by his constituents to the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives. Now, he's there, and he does a very good job. In fact, on 3 separate occasions in the early 1780s, he ends up becoming Speaker of the House, essentially one of the main players in Pennsylvania's House. Again, this is at a time that, although the federal government had been established, the state governments were very largely important, much, much more important to the people's lives than the federal government was at the time. So Snyder is a Democratic Republican, which is great because Pennsylvania was largely Democratic Republican by this point, as was most of the country, and Thomas Jefferson was president. He gets along swimmingly with Mr. Jefferson and gets along swimmingly with President James Madison. And it's about this time that Snyder is actually elected governor of Pennsylvania. This gristmill operator is just such a charismatic, knowledgeable politician that he goes from gristmill owner to governor of Pennsylvania, the third governor, in fact. Now, he did run once to outseat Thomas McKeon, who was the previous governor and a Declaration of Independence signer, pretty important guy. And then he does not win the first time. But the second time he runs, McKeon resigns because you could only run for 3 consecutive terms at the time in Pennsylvania. And Snyder doesn't beat McKeon. McKeon finishes his 3rd term, and Snyder comes in and takes over and becomes the 3rd governor of Pennsylvania. As I said, he holds the position for 3 terms, so 9 years. During this time, the War of 1812 breaks out, and Pennsylvania is very important to supporting the War of 1812. Again, it was one of the most Democratic Republican states. They actively supported Ben Franklin. They also, because, you have Henry Clay being a war hawk at the time in Kentucky, western Pennsylvania is not far from Kentucky, and a lot of the same sentiments prevailed out there. So McKeon is very important. Simon Snyder is very important to James Madison's overseeing of the War of 1812. He recruits a lot of men. He gets fiscal support. There's not a lot of fighting in Pennsylvania, though it is close to the Erie. Erie, Pennsylvania does touch Lake Erie. And a lot of the fighting of the War of 1812, the naval battles, were on the Great Lakes, which are better described as seas. If they weren't, my understanding is if they weren't freshwater, they would be considered seas because they are gigantic. Anyway, after Snyder finishes his 3rd term, he's actually floated as a candidate for vice president when James Monroe runs. Now, Snyder declines the position and declines to run in general, but he was floated, and he would have been expected to win. I mean, James Madison essentially ran unopposed. The second time he ran unopposed. The first time the Democratic Republicans had such a sweeping majority in the nation, especially with the fervor of winning the War of 1812, aka the Second American Revolutionary War, in addition to, James Monroe's first term is considered the era of good feelings. So it would have been really nice for Snyder to have been vice president for that time, but he doesn't. He decides not to run, and instead we get Daniel D. Tompkins, who was governor of New York through the War of 1812, which was a much more important state during that war. But we're not going to get into that now. That is a brief history of the life of Simon Snyder, 3rd governor of Pennsylvania.